So welcome everyone. There's a few challenges here this morning in terms of the technicalities, so kindly bear with me. First of all, I'm trying to get the video running, and there's also some echo happening here. Let me just see. Anyway, welcome all of you, and thank you for your patience. Let's just see here. It should be working. Okay. Oh, it's odd. I suppose we could do this without webcam. It's really the lesser important aspect of this. It's just odd. So, oh well. I think we'll probably manage, I should think. And the most important thing really is the text that we're studying. So I think we'll proceed with that. So as always, recognizing how much suffering there is, and just from our own experience in our own lives, the sufferings that we have, that which pains us, and looking around us, seeing how much suffering there is in the world around us. Very often, looking around us actually humbles us somewhat in putting our own sufferings in perspective. But universally, regardless, we need to understand that the entire condition of samsara is premised around a fundamental confusion, a fundamental mistake. And we're so fortunate that we have the Buddha's teaching that can work on this. Not like some miracle cure that just instantly will remove everything, but for us to beginning to have a grip and get some sense of the direction in which we need to move in order to diminish our suffering, beginning to discover a dimension that's free from confusion, and as such having that sense of being on a path that has this profound vision and result since the time of the Buddha for 2,500 years. So many remarkable men and women have really just shown us the way in which we need to go, and we don't need to we don't understand the path in terms of just the enormity of enlightenment, but pretty much also in terms of us applying ourselves in terms of the path. So just seeing how the Dharma works within our own experience, understanding then also how this suffering that we're prone to and the confusion that we're prone to, this is so rampant in others. So that's where in samsara, we're not really about blaming anybody. We're about understanding how all sentient beings suffer. And not only do they suffer, but also they are in fact beings that within to the best of their capacity, have looked after us, aided us, assisted us. So there's this sympathy for sentient beings and also the gratitude towards sentient beings. So this is very much what informs our journey here in terms of our study. What we're presently then looking at is this text, which you could say, just like the Buddha's teaching is like medicine, then a text like this really enables us to gain confidence in the medicine on the basis of seeing that this medicine is based on not just something strange and extraterrestrial, but very much based on what we can validate in terms of our own reasoning, in terms of our own direct experience. And that's what gives us tremendous confidence in the path, when we can assert the validity of this. And this text here is going to be presenting the two truths. And presently then, as we're approaching this, we're just going through some preliminaries that are basic to the way a text is approached in the Buddhist tradition. So anyway, we'll begin with then invoking the wisdom of Jakob Mipham Rinpoche, the author, who then again, not somebody ordinary, but somebody who was a great bodhisattva who really manifested in this world and was able to show the path of enlightenment, clarify the path of enlightenment, and who's, you say, on the basis of his bodhicitta, then has had an enormous impact in terms of the practice of the path. Through the blessing of awareness, emptiness, Manjushri Kumara, you opened the expanse of wisdom and its 8 minds of courage, thus mastering the vast treasuries of transmission and realization. Mipham Manjushri Ghosha, I supplicate you. Okay. So, in terms of the text itself, then, we're presently actually. This is just briefly on the. This is commentary then on the root text, where we start off actually. Mipham Rinpoche writes, "This philosophy is unmistaken. All errors have been eliminated. The mind is free from doubt about 3 points. I pay homage to Manjushri, the treasure of wisdom." Now that's where for us to engage in a medicine, there has to be that we have to be certain that the science behind the medicine is valid. And the premise for any science is that that it has to have validity. We have to make sure that the science, the methodology, the people who are undertaking the surgery or whatever, they know what they're doing. They're not making mistakes. There's no sort of, you'd say, poking around in confusion. There's a clarity, and as such, yes, we validate this as the first thing that we need to have certainty at first that this is valid. So this is where Mipham Rinpoche makes the absolutely essential statement to begin with. This philosophy is unmistaken, but also then Mipham Rinpoche substantiates it. It's not as if it's valid because it says so in our books. We are establishing this on the basis of reasonings, and we've been looking at various forms of reasoning. And so we are presently then, we've looked at the teacher, the teaching, and so forth, and why we would assert these as valid. And now we're at the presently then using reasoning to establish validity. So this is then the third line in the opening verse, where it says, "The mind is free from doubt about 3 points." So here then Mipham Rinpoche says, going on to the third line of the verse, by using the 3 types of investigation. Now the 3 types of investigation is basic to everything we have in the Buddhist teaching, and that is what we can directly ourselves experience, what we can validly, empirically observe, but that is also where we include the subjective dimension, the mind. So that's where you could say there's a point of departure in terms of the scope, but the method is the same as we have it with natural sciences. What we call empiricism is what we can validate on the basis of our own direct observation. The second is inference, and that's where we can logically assert. For example, we say phenomena are impermanent. We can't directly perhaps see this, but we can assert, yes, anything that necessarily is composite must be impermanent. And we also sometimes exemplify this kind of inference. For example, when we see smoke behind a mountain, we say, oh yeah, well, there's smoke, there must be a fire. That's where there's a clear, you could say, link between the signs that we're observing and the logical conclusion that we're drawing. Then finally, yes, we do rely on the authority of those that have seen, and that's in this case when we talk about particularly what we call hidden phenomena, such as the specifics of karma, the understanding of rebirth, the understanding of things that are not directly manifest to us. We can rely on those who can see this clearly. Again, this is also where we don't just sort of go with anybody who might make a statement, but we validate those that make such statements. So for example, like I usually say, I believe in the moon landing, but there would be people who don't believe in the moon landing and think it's all a hoax. So that's where I tend to have faith and basically assume, yes, that's probably most likely did happen. And similarly also, yes, I can't necessarily understand the particulars of aspects of karma and the causes of conditions that have led to a particular situation, but I can more or less understand the logic of it, and I can trust then, for example, with great sages that would explain aspects like that. And similarly, many aspects of the Buddhist teaching. And that's where there needs to then be an establishment of the validity of the teacher. But that we have in our culture all the time when we refer to, for example, great scientists and authorities on particular topics. So these are the three types of investigation: direct perception, logical inference, and reliance on scripture. And also last time we established what we mean with scripture. Something doesn't become scripture just because it's written in a book, but it also doesn't mean that it necessarily has to come down from a god or something like that. We can very well rely on great individuals. Then it says here, by using these three types of investigation, 2 points have been established. First, that the teachings are pure, clear, and incomparable, and an incomparable entrance to complete liberation. So this is what we've covered before. And then also second, that the teacher, the Buddha, is an incomparable, valid, great being on the basis of his perfect intention, activity, and result. The third point is that the previous 2 points are established through reasoning. So this is really important. What we looked at before is on the basis of using our logic. It's not just that we just tag along. Of course, there's probably an element of giving, if you're a Buddhist, then probably taking refuge in the Buddha as someone you rely on, then yes, then there is probably an element of giving the Buddha the benefit of the doubt, so to speak. But that really is where the Buddha then says, yes, but you actually shouldn't rely on the teaching on the basis of just faith in my person, but on the basis of your own analysis, your own inquiry. Then it says here, by using reasoning of a valid proof, in which the three criteria for valid evidence are complete, which we didn't just look at, along with the three aspects of valid inference, these points can be established without a doubt. So just with regards to these three criteria and the three aspects, we went over this last time. So we have the three criteria is then when we talk about the valid evidence's presence in the subject of debate, the positive pervasion and the counter pervasion. That is where we say a pot is impermanent as it is a composite phenomenon. We don't just take that as, you could say, true because somebody said it, but we can actually validate that. Yes, pot, the reasoning, or rather this being a composite phenomenon, is a pot being a composite phenomenon then substantiates that it is impermanent. We don't just say yes, sir. And we can also see that if something is permanent, then it can't be a composite phenomenon. And if something is a composite phenomena, it necessarily is impermanent. That's where we talk about the positive and counter pervasions. And then we have that was the three criteria, and the three types are then what we just said before: the direct perception of manifest phenomena, inference for hidden phenomena, and valid scriptures for very hidden phenomena. So having covered that, then it says here, to phrase this as a syllogism. And of course, this is where then we're definitely coming from a place of accepting the quality of the Buddha as something that is, you could say, a valid phenomenon, in the sense that all of Buddhism is premised not on the objective dimension of where we, for example, can establish particular truths around objective phenomena. Essentially, what the thrust of the whole Buddhist teaching is working with the subjective dimension of the mind. And that's where, of course, we're looking at individuals. We're not looking at you could say, external objects. So we do refer to, in this case, then it says here, the Buddha, the teacher of the Buddha is a valid great being because his teachings are valid scriptures. And that's where we've looked at earlier what we call valid scripture is something that necessarily is what we in the modern vernacular would refer to as sound science. Then it says a similar example is a genuine great sage. So that's where there is this confidence in the individual on the basis of their teaching being valid. So we can say the Buddha teaches everything is impermanent, things don't last, etc., etc. All of this then necessarily establishes the Buddha as somebody who speaks the truth. We can rely on the Buddha, but not because he's empowered by some divine force or because there's a lot of agreement, but basically because we can assert the validity of what the Buddha is saying. So the first criterion of valid truth here, the presence of the reason in the subject, namely then that the reason being because his teaching is valid, it's true, they are present in the subject, which is the Buddha. This is fulfilled because the philosophy of these valid scriptures is established as the words of our teacher, the Buddha. The second criterion of a valid truth, the positive pervasion, is fulfilled because the scriptural teachings are valid. It's fulfilled because if the scriptural teachings are valid, then they are definitely taught by a valid great being, which in this case is the Buddha. So if the teachings are true, then they're coming from the Buddha. In this case, we're talking about, we say that 84,000 different teachings that we have. Then if they are true, then they must be coming from, in this case, we say a Buddha. But of course, what we generally mean is that if the medicine works, then it must come from someone who clearly has knowledge. If let's say we choose acupuncture, then we are willing to have needles poked into us and so forth. Well, this is because we've already established that acupuncture works. And similarly also with other sort of cases in which where we can see that the product is something that works, and this then reflects on the authenticity of the source of this product. The third criterion of a valid truth, the counter-pervasion, is fulfilled because if the teacher is not a valid great being, then the scriptural teachings certainly will not be valid. So if this comes from some, fly-by-night guru or whatever, or the product is just something that's made by somebody who doesn't really know the subject very well, yes, well then also the result will be accordingly. So we have these, essentially the point being that the teaching of the Buddha is being valid, then we can also validate the Buddha as such, as somebody who is the great being, on the basis of essentially analyzing the Buddha's teaching. So then Paltner says, by using reasoning based on these three types of valid cognition, direct perception, inference, and valid scriptures concerning the Buddha and the teaching, then the highest sort of devotion, unfailing confidence, certainty will arise in one's mind. Okay, now let me just say something about these terms that we're using here, the types and the criteria, right? This might be new for some of us, but I think also most of us can kind of get that this is something we actually use in everyday life. It's very much on which we base our trust. We trust particular people. As a result of that, we also tend to trust what they say. And before we know these people, if we find out that what they say is valid, then we begin to trust them. So there's this back and forth between, you could say, the reasoning and the subject. That is something that takes place all the time. Also, with regards to these terms, positive and negative pervasion, it might be something new for us, but it essentially, as we can see, it's the foundation for sound science, for logical understanding, not just blind faith. And that's why if this is new for us, okay, just give it some time. There's not a whole lot of other things that are going to come that you could say might challenge what we're used to here. But it certainly extracts Buddhism from this unfortunate label of, you could say, blind faith or philosophy or religion, and where there's just sort of vague speculation, and makes it incredibly accurate. And that's also where what the Khenpo is saying here is, it's on the basis of that we then have unfailing confident certainty. Unless, or if we don't have that, then we're just going to be, looking at the teaching, and does it please me? Or am I in a good mood, and is there a good feeling with the teaching, and this, that, and the other, and all of that. And then it's always back and forth, and it's completely just comes and goes like the wind. And there's no, you could say, foundation of certainty. And that's where without this kind of certainty, it's very difficult to actually have any benefit from the Dharma at all. Just like if we are taking a medicine and we sort of take it some days, but then some other days we don't, then the doctor will tell us, well, it's not going to work unless we apply this on a regular basis. So to have that full, wholehearted, you could say, engagement, this kind of unfailing confidence, certainty, is absolutely indispensable. The Khenpo says this type of devotion is the essence of the ultimate way of taking refuge and making supplication. It is the root of the path of liberation, the root of blessings entering one's mind, the single root of hundreds of positive qualities. This also applies then to what we call blessings, because once there's a complete trust, then we can sense something that ordinarily our logical mind fails to observe. And that's where you could say the deep qualities of the path, such as realization of wisdom and so forth, which lies beyond the ordinary linear rational mind, that is premised on this complete openness, a complete trust, where we could actually experience and see something that lies that lies beyond language and concepts. And that, as well as all sorts of other qualities that come from having trust in the nature of the teaching. So the second Buddha, Guru Rinpoche, said, when your mind has devotion of certainty, then blessings enter. When your mind is free of doubt, your wishes are fulfilled. Now, there's again, along the lines of what I was just saying before, the nature of what this science, or the nature of what we're doing with the path, is about the mind. It's again a science around what is intangible. And that's where we rely so much on the living embodiment, the Buddha, the teacher. And in this case, also Manjushri, who is understood, of course, we talk about Manjushri as a great bodhisattva, but also Manjushri is understood really in terms of the abiding capacity that every sentient being possesses of wisdom. So when we come across the teachings, it resounds and aligns itself with wisdom that we already naturally possess. But we're paying homage not just to a vague abstract principle, but then Manjushri as embodied. So we say, then the fourth line then here in the root text, it says, I pay homage to Manjushri, the treasure of wisdom. So the Khenpo says, therefore homage is paid to Manjushri, the great treasure of wisdom. He embodies the precious, unfailing, heartfelt wisdom of certainty, the incomparable intelligence, like the 1,000 light rays of the sun, free from the thick darkness of doubt. Also intelligence, free of doubt, arises from the blessings of Manjushri, the great treasure of wisdom. So homage can be paid from that perspective as well. Now, doubt is something that clouds us. And in this case, it's not very helpful. What we're doing here is working with the mind. So as long as there's doubt, then we won't really be able to work constructively with the mind. We're kind of like not really, we're taking the medicine, but then we leave it. We're sort of not clear on what we're doing. And so the path is really premised on us first hearing the teaching. And that's where you could say that we can do, but then we have to be proactive. It's just not enough that we buy the medicine and it then sits on the shelves. We actually have to engage in questioning. And that's where we can't say, oh, the guru is wonderful and I love the guru, because that will pass. There will be days where we have plenty of, annoyance with the guru. So that's where there has to be this investigation of what the teacher is saying. So that's where we actually need to be proactive in reflecting. And again, you could say, asserting the nature of the teachings. And we're all the time being exposed to aspects of the teachings that are intended to expand our horizons. And if we don't actually engage in this, our horizons won't expand. We'll just stay with the same narrow perspective. And as such, nothing really much happens. So that for us to actually truly gain wisdom and for all the qualities of the path to arise, there has to be freedom from doubt. And that has to come on the basis of welcoming doubt. That's where, of course, this is where there's a big difference from those systems that say, no, no, you shouldn't doubt. You should just open yourself to the great divine and let it into your heart, which is great if you can do that. But the thing is, in many cases, you sort of let the great divine into your heart, but then again, you sort of have some second doubts or however, and you might also come from a culture in which we actually don't just let anything into our heart. We validate, we investigate. And this, of course, the Buddha also encouraged. So this process of working with the doubt, welcoming doubt as something that actually prompts us to investigate. And when we investigate, then we actually get the answer. I remember as a kid hating math and not understanding it. I would then go to my friends and I'll say, okay, I can't figure this out. Can you help me? And then finally, when something clicks, then you go, oh yeah, of course. And similarly, also with the Buddhist teaching, there has to be this clicking that takes place. Ah, of course. And that's where we begin to gradually expand our vision, to gradually understand more. So this is where the process is one in which our, you could say, engagement in questioning and thinking about requires that we're proactive in this process. And that's also where the practice of meditation is so helpful, because without practicing meditation, all of this remains as philosophy. It remains as theory. It remains as something that we actually don't have any relationship with. And that's where we're really just voyeurs, or sort of just treating this as some sort of merchandise that we just have. And it's not really something that we're living. So for us to actually relate to what's being talked about here, then we have to necessarily meditate and become increasingly sensitized to the dynamics of our mind, where we understand what it is that drives our confusion and what we can do about it. So the Khenpo says this homage has two purposes: the benefit of self and the benefit of others. So the first, by showing that the teacher is a noble being, Mipham accumulated merit. So this homage benefits him. The homage benefits others when students generate devotion and interest in the teaching and the teacher. So whenever we have a teaching in the Indo-Tibetan tradition, there's always these two components, generally, which is the teacher's homage and then their commitment to write the text. So there's a quote here from a sutra of the vast display that states, those who have merit can fulfill their intentions. So to actually compose and complete the text, there has to be this initial component of merit, which is then what is being said here. And the great master Nagarjuna says, it is not fruitless to pay homage to the teacher who composed the commentary. This is because devotion and interest are generated for the teacher and the commentary. So as such, then this also reflects on the student's interest then. Okay, so we've done the homage, and then this second element, which is then the commitment to completing this. This is also something that is a standard element in all Indo-Tibetan compositions. So it says here, the teachings of the Sugata are profound, vast, and difficult to realize. For those who wish to taste this deathless nectar, I will bestow the light of intelligence. So this is Mipham's promise to essentially help others. This is about throwing light on what could enable us to cut through the cause of suffering and confusion. But it's a path that goes right down to the core of working with our being. So it's not easy. It's not what we've been habituated to. We've been habituated to everything but that. And that's where this is a turnaround. This is a shift. So that's where this requires intelligence, and Mipham Rinpoche is then going to the best of his ability, then provide that light. So the commentary says, and this goes for the whole entire this second verse here, it says, the absolute aspect of the teaching is profound, by being free from all extremes, such as existence and non-existence. Now, this is so beautiful because this means that the absolute nature of this teaching is not about thought. It's not about philosophy. It's not about asserting it's in one way or asserting it's another way. It's about us engaging in that which is true and free from these ordinary ways in which we diminish reality, giving reality labels. It's this, it's that, and so forth. So that's where what the Buddha is working towards is for us to free ourselves from our addiction to narrow down reality. And that's what we call, these are what we call extremes. When we sort of say, well, if it's not this way, then it's that way, you know? We're not hearing, we're not feeling, we're not touching. That's where the Buddha wishes us to open up. So that's where we would say the absolute aspect of the teaching is profound because there is this scope of this freedom which is beyond the ordinary ways in which we limit reality. But nevertheless, there is the compassionate aspect of the teaching that engages in our present reality. And that's why there's teachings on the path and understanding the conditions that we face in the present. So that's where the commentary then says the relative aspect of the teaching is vast by encompassing the bodhisattva levels, the paramitas, and so on. Since these profound and vast teachings are difficult to realize, the Mahayana teachings of the Sugata are like deathless nectar. For fortunate ones who wish to taste them and practice them, Mipham says he will bestow the light of excellent explanations that will bring forth flawless intelligence in their minds. This is the author's promise in composing the text. In this context, Acharya Nagarjuna then says, noble ones do not make many promises, because if one has made a difficult promise, it is like carving on stone. Even death does not make it go away. So that's where, in this case, we can rely on the commitment of the author to then complete this, and this is also the author's own, you could say, pledge to himself and to those that are studying it. Good. Well then, chapter 3, the two truths, and this is then where we are entering into what the text really is about. The two truths is about what is reality, but also how do we get at reality. So and how do we presently experience reality? So there is the absolute truth, that is what we are intending to uncover. The inability to understand absolute truth is what keeps us in pain and suffering. And while we presently don't have really an understanding of absolute truth, we then have the skillful means of the path that enable us to create the right conditions, to open us up, to let go of our narrow-mindedness, and essentially work with the path that compassionately takes into consideration who we are, what we are, how we see things. And so that's where we, all along the line, the Buddhist teaching operate with this understanding of the two truths. Essentially, truth as seen by a sage and truth as seen by a confused sentient beings. So this is then what we call the second section. And like the Khenpo was saying, this text then, like any Dharma, it's good in the beginning, it's good in the middle, and it's good in the end. So we presently covered the good in the beginning, the homage and the commitment. And then we're going to look at the second section. So the Khenpo says, which is good in the middle. It is the subject matter of the composition. This will be explained in three parts. The two truths, which are the topic to be comprehended. The two types of reasoning, which are what does the comprehending and the result of comprehension. So essentially, understanding what it is, what are these two truths? And we're going to look at various ways of approaching this. And the reasoning, not just if you say, what two truths do you want me to believe in? And we'd say, yes, sir, you know. It's something needs to be understood. And then there's the reasoning that undertakes this, that enables us to actually connect and click Then there's a discussion about what that leads to. So it says, the Dharma taught by the Buddhas is completely based on the two truths, the worldly, relative truth, and the supreme, absolute truth. So overall, the Buddha gave a multitude of teachings, which are like 84,000 entrances to the Noble Dharma. They can be summed up in the two truths, which are the subject matter here. And let's just be clear, when we say Dharma, Dharma means the insight into reality. The Buddha didn't invent it. We sadly, in the modern vernacular, refer to it as Buddhism, as if it was some sort of ism and that there was some sort of like, system. And of course there is. For the sake of connecting, yes, there has to be an address, there has to be a name, a logo, a website, all of this, yes. But the nature of the Dharma is the nature of reality. That is what the Buddha wished us to connect to, not to a set of cultural practices or language or whatever. It's about breaking free from confusion. This is what Dharma is about. Dharma means a lot of things, and it means the nature of phenomena. But of course, when we have it with a capital D and we talk about the Sat Dharma or Sudharma or the Noble Dharma, yes, then it refers to then the guidance that the Buddha gave in terms of us understanding reality. So that's where we talk about the Noble Dharma. And that is where there has to be the humble acknowledgement that presently we're confused, and yet our confusion doesn't eliminate reality. Reality is not touched by our confusion. We need to see reality. As long as we're not aligned with reality, we fail and we suffer. So that's where we have presently the reality of the worldly relative truth, and then, yes, the supreme absolute truth, the scope of the sages. So the Khenpo says, what are the two truths? They are the relative truth of worldly beings and the absolute truth that transcends the world. As for what is meant by the world, Chandrakirti says in his clear words, Sixel. Then it says, worldly beings are known to be their aggregates. The world definitely depends on the aggregates. It follows that the world refers to individuals who designate things on the basis of the aggregates. So this is, once we have the initial confusion, sentient beings fixate on their aggregates and experience then a world accordingly. Then the Khenpo says, we need to understand that the highest possible realization is the realization of the true truth, just as it is. As one progresses through the yanas, one realizes how the true truth more and more profoundly express the way things truly are. Here we will briefly examine the two truths by presenting them in 5 ways, according to their essence, definitions, characteristics, classification, and purpose. So you'll appreciate the style of Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, which is very systematic. And we very often operate with, we're going to approach this from different angles. And that's actually very reassuring and very, you can say, scientific, structured, and really just, you could say, the formula here, the methodology is really to enable us to truly get our heads around what's being talked about. So first then, the essence of the two truths. First, the essence of the relative is the realm of objects conceptualized through the mind and the sense faculties. And that's where we need to, again, this is where it's indispensable really that we meditate, or that we have an awareness of what's happening with ourselves, that we're not just looking around and saying, I want this and I'm not getting it, or I don't want this to happen and this is what I want it to happen. There has to be an understanding that it's a mind that is engaging with a realm in which we label things in particular ways. So that's where if I get so I order coffee and somebody brings me tea, Well, the tea doesn't think, oh, I'm not what this person wants, or the coffee doesn't think I am what this person wants. It's entirely me who's just thinking I didn't order coffee or tea or whatever, right? So that's where the objects themselves, they don't exist in terms of particular, you could say, labels, but we label phenomena, and we of course relate to the whole phenomenal world in this way. But this is something we need to think about and need to actually explore. And of course, this is where we have teachings like the Abhidharma, because the Buddha didn't think, oh yeah, well, just get with the program, mate. You know, there was never that. Compassionately, the Buddha taught in so many different ways, again and again and again, ways in which we can begin to understand this fact. But the bottom line is we need to actually ourselves test it and see for ourselves how this actually applies. So that's why we can't just keep sort of saying, okay, hey, what is it again? And, you know, actually just hearing and then internally beginning to see how it works. So that's about the relative, that's the essence of what we call the relative truth. The essence of the absolute is the realm of self-knowing, discerning wisdom, free from the intellect and its fabricated extremes. And this is very much on the, you could say, the assertive side. Sometimes we define the absolute in terms of the emptiness of inherent existence, but particularly here then in terms of, you could say, the highest view of actually asserting the unconditional mind that's no longer deluded, that has complete realization of this emptiness nature, then this is asserted in terms of this luminous quality of self-knowing, reflexive awareness, or this unconditional discerning wisdom. And this is not something that is free from, this is not something that is understood through, you could say, intellect, language, and so forth. The way of the Bodhisattva says, the absolute is not within the domain of the mind. The mind is said to be relative. And in the Madhyamika Avatara, Entrance to the Middle Way, it states, all phenomena have two natures, which are seen truly or falsely. What is seen truly is the ultimate nature. What is seen falsely is the relative nature. So we'll see the Tibetan word for Döndam, the Tibetan word for the absolute is Döndam, which really means, you could say, the sublime truth. The other is Kunzom, and that literally means concealing everything. So we're stuck on appearances. That's why we always talk about, you know, seeing through appearances and the sort of, failing to see how things are on the basis of just looking at the superficial level. And the superficial level then veils the actual reality. So that's what we then refer to as relative truth. That's which veils. The Tibetan word, like I say, kunzop, that really just means that which veils everything. That's the essence. Now it says the definition of the true truth. Second, as for the definitions, the word relative is illusory appearances with no real essence. So that's how we understood relative truth. It's illusory appearances with no real essence. However, temporarily, from a deluded perspective, their specific characteristics are unfailingly true. This is relative truth. That's why we have cause and effect. There's a big difference between virtue and non-virtue. There's a big difference between suffering and not suffering, and so on. So that's where the entrance to the middle way states, because ignorance obscures the nature, it is relative. Whatever is constructed is an untrue appearance. The Buddha called this the all-concealing relative truth. The true truth then states, the relative obscures what is genuine for a person in relation to a thing. The absolute is the ultimate goal. And because the path and result is unfailing, it is called truth. The clear words states, it is the ultimate and it is also excellent. So it is absolute. Since it is also true, it is called the absolute truth. The light of the middle way states, the unmistaken subjective mind is all the wisdom arising from hearing, contemplating, and meditating on the genuine meaning. It's called the absolute because it is the ultimate. So again, this is where wisdom is something that we get at on the basis of process that takes us there. But The nature itself is unchanging. And that's where failing to see the nature, it's veiled. And that is what then is referred to as that which conceals phenomena. The absolute truth is then reality, phenomena as they actually exist. Okay, let's just see if there's some questions. Again, I apologize about the camera just not working. It's hooked up. I don't know what I'm. Yeah, it's just not. Seems to be the software that's not doing it. I think the camera itself is fine. I just used it yesterday. Anyway, let's just see here. Some questions. Okay, looks like we have some questions. Great. Oh, okay, here's a long one. The need for the 3 criteria to be satisfied before we accept anything is great. It seems to me that the vast majority of Buddhism does satisfy those 3. However, there are some aspects that do not seem to satisfy all 3, and 1 or 3 that we are told to simply accept only on the basis that the great being says so. As a scientist, I find myself unable to accept those few aspects on the basis of trust. Totally, I get that, totally. There have been many errors in Western science resulting from such blind faith in the proclamation of scientists who were great in their time and in the context of time. Of course. And that is where we established, you could say, the validity of the Buddha on the basis of the, you could say, validity of the teaching. And that's where, yes, we apply these 3 criteria. And of course, to the best of our ability. And that is where we, to a large extent, really need to rely on that sort of empirical aspect of our own introspection and asserting the validity of the teaching. But on the other hand, there's also an intuitive dimension which also becomes part of that process. But I completely understand the reluctance that a modern person would have with regards to, let's say, things that are what we call particularly hidden, you know, where maybe the Buddha would say, well, you're experiencing this because in a previous life this happened. And that's where we would say, well, the Buddha's right because the Buddha is the Buddha. So that's where at many times then of course we as such then are giving the benefit of the doubt to the Buddha. But that said, there's also a question, we need to also question the whole project, which is very different here, because this is about the mind and the cognitive obscuration that we actually would attribute to the Buddha as having eliminated. And that's where we ourselves, when we journey, we could possibly begin to observe how our own cognitive, you could say, obscurations are beginning to diminish. And as such, we could maybe infer that possibly someone could entirely penetrate cognitive obscurations. So that's where, again, we are not looking at, and that's where it's very clear, you know, like I'm always quoting the Dalai Lama, who says, oh, science has never been a problem for me. Only one victim. I no longer believe in Mount Meru. And that's where we need to identify that there are certain aspects of the Buddhist teaching that are, you could say, not particularly important. Well, that's the sort of the cosmology. But what really is important is everything that has to do with consciousness. And that's where if we investigate, probably we might be satisfied with the understanding that we have in the Buddhist teaching on the issues of consciousness and the nature that consciousness, you could say, manifests in its confused condition of samsara and in its non-confused condition of enlightenment. But yes, and it's a process. And I would say anybody who engages with the Buddhist teaching definitely should take the Buddha up on his, you could say, call for questioning. On the other hand, also, we shouldn't be married with skepticism. And that's where, you know, in many cases, like I said, I could very well investigate the whole thing about the moon landing and go through all the many websites that are for and against. But there's also a place where I just say, well, I kind of just sort of think, yep, you know, I believe these guys, you know, and like I'm always saying, I've never been to Argentina or seen it, but I kind of just think, okay, seems to be a general sort of agreement from people I rely on that Argentina actually does exist and so forth. So that's where, but we have to make this very much, I think, our own really journey, and we are encouraged to continually question and essentially, you could say, um, you know, draw our conclusions to the best of our ability. But that is where we, as you know, questions around, you could say, the view of the primacy of consciousness versus the materialist view of primacy of matter. That's such an interesting discussion that I think really is essential. And for us in the modern world, there are topics that particularly for us will be interesting to continually pursue. Yes, so at the same time also then there will be those who will tell you, well, you know, the Buddha said, you know, there's a poisonous arrow, you've been hit by a poisonous arrow, how much do you want to know about the poison? How much should we investigate who done it? And how much do you want to sort of know about the physician? Maybe we should just get on to actually extracting it. So that's where some would say, okay, yes, we can question up to a certain point. But there's also a point where we have to really get on to extracting the problem. Then again, if you extract the arrow and you feel better, well, you begin to have faith in the physician, right? And et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. Doubt has saved many from making fatal errors of judgment. I see it as a very precious quality. Yes, that's what, of course, the Buddha also agrees with. Although, yes, it can also stop us from moving forward. I think it's important to maintain a balance. We agree. Is mind here the sixth consciousness in relative truth? All eight consciousnesses are relative truth. So everything that manifests in terms of the various consciousnesses is essentially, you could say, the delusional condition. Hello, is there a recording link for this study? I seem to have missed it. It's in the email that you received, in which, you know, for you to get in here, you click the particular, well, you actually registered. So it's in the email that with which you registered. Anyway, if you don't have it, I'll send it again. Yeah. The absolute truth is only have to be experienced because it is not the domain of the relative. Is the relative belongs to the understanding, the interdependent origination. Well, relative is when we misunderstand, you could say, the interdependent nature of all that appears. So that's where failing to understand interdependent origination, holding it as solid, failing to see its empty nature, that is where we get tangled in our particular relative perceptions. But within that reality, yes, like Tonsa Rinpoche, it works beautifully. There's cause and effect, and it works according to how we see things. But it is nevertheless, you could say, it is a deluded condition. So it's failing to essentially understand properly the dependent origination. Can you recommend a specific text or course to begin to study Abhidharma? Yeah, well, we've studied. I always recommend Trungpa Rinpoche for beginning anything really. So there's a text that's called Glimpses of Abhidharma. So that's particularly helpful. And then also recently we studied one by Professor Stephen Goodman. It's called The Buddhist Psychology of Awakening. So these come to mind, and there you have recordings of our study of that. But there's a lot of texts out there. The language and terms do take time to integrate, if you like. Would you say more on that? Although I have been around Buddhism, it's the first time I've challenged my confidence with this language. Yeah, because very often Buddhism in the modern world is sort of a little bit like we rush in and we just say, "Oh, I'd like that." You know, it's glittery and it shines, and I like to have that. And that's what happens with the, you could say, Buddhism. It's sort of like, oh, there's all these amazing techniques. Please, Guruji, can you teach me this technique and that technique? And we in the modern world, we stuck with a little bit of a rather colonialist attitude that that well, science, oh, that's us. We know science. So there's very often sort of the idea of Buddhists that we don't need to know science. We already have a science. But that's where there's a huge difference between the science that we were brought up with and sort of the ideas we were inculcated through our you could say conditioning and learning and education, and also within the common discourse that is completely different from the way that we approach it in the Buddhist context. So it's very nice to sort of come across Buddhist methods and practice and all of that. But if we're still believing the tales that we've been told, when we grew up, then it's very difficult to actually understand what we're doing on the Buddhist path. So that's where, as Buddhism, you could say the assimilation of Buddhism progresses, we're going to be having to actually sort of look a little bit at the science behind this excellent medicine. Is mind's natural state unconfused? Yep. If so, what is it? What is it that is actually confused? Where does the confusion reside? Very good. Look, this is we were actually studying in the Treasury of Precious Qualities the other day, and it is where the 12 links of dependent origination begin. It's simply just a moment of blackout. You could say at the time of the standard explanation of what we often say, particularly in the Great Perfection teaching, the time of the original ground, before there's even notion of confusion and non-confusion, there is an abiding purity that resides. But at one point, somehow, on the basis of the appearances, we get carried away, and all of a sudden, we become self-conscious, and we think, I am the manifestation, and we begin to think of these as two different things. So this is it. At the same time, this is something that we continually return to. On this journey, we're continually coming back to this place in which we can actually address this. It's not a solid thing. This confused condition is not solid. It's something that really is just there when we don't look. So that's again where the Buddha is encouraging us to please just look. And because we are so hung up in our ideas and beliefs, yes, then this is accommodated very kindly with all the countless teachings. But in reality, it's really about us just, if we could just take one good look, that would do it. So we have, of course, stories about remarkable individuals who were able to actually, you could say, get over their confusion just on the basis of just looking. But for most of us, it's a journey. We need to actually begin to, you could say, shift our understanding of our reality and seeing again how do we get tangled up and how can we untangle this situation. That's where we have a path. Actually, just in regard to that question, I uploaded a little chapter that I think is very, very helpful. It's called The Development of Ego. It's uploaded in the resources folder of the study of Treasury of Precious Qualities. So I can also upload it here in our resource folder in this particular study. Okay. No further questions? So strange with that camera. I'm sure as soon as this class is over, it'll just work beautifully. No, che cosa. Okay. Thank you, everyone. And we shall continue here next week. Through all our births, where we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night, realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning. May we cross the ocean of existence in that life, thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world. May we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. Thank you.